Hello everyone. Welcome to the EUROSTUDENT Talks webinar. I'm very happy to see you all here. I'm Madeleine, and as you know, today we are focusing on a very intriguing topic, international student mobility and the impact of the pandemic on student mobility. And as we know from the EUROSTUDENT data as well, Erasmus Plus program is the most common organizational framework for going abroad as a student. And therefore, I'm very happy to welcome here Juan Rayon Gonzalez. Hello, Juan.
Hello, good morning, Marlene. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
It's our pleasure as well. So Juan is the president of Erasmus Student Network, ESN. He is originally from Spain. He has a bachelor in law from the University of Oviedo. And now he is currently finishing 2 masters in international law and in European studies. Juan has been Erasmus student himself in Istanbul, and also he has participated in the European Solidarity Corps in Italy. And he joined the ESN in 2016 after he moved to Granada after his mobility with Erasmus. And now, as I said, he is the president of the whole Erasmus Student Network. So is there anything else you would like to say about yourself, or did I cover everything?
You covered everything, more than enough. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. But then I think that we can move on with the topic already. And I'm kindly reminding all our listeners that you're absolutely welcome to join in with your comments and questions. You can use the chat window. But once we also have the discussion part later, you can turn on your microphone, your camera, raise hand, and also join in to the discussion this way. But anyways, I know that Juan has prepared the presentation, so the floor, or I must say the screen, is yours now, so feel free.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marlene. You can hear me and see me well, right? Everything okay in terms of connection? Fantastic. So I'm going to start with a short presentation. Let's hope it will not take too long so we can have a longer discussion with some of the findings from the ESN survey that we did in 2021, in which I'm going to be talking a bit about the impact of the pandemic, but always trying to put, let's say, our findings in a forward-looking perspective, right? It looks like hopefully the pandemic, even if it's not fully behind us, it's not going to affect so much mobility flows and also the types of mobilities, but for sure it has had a very important impact. So now I'm going to share my screen. Very good. I think you can see it well, my screen. Marlene, can you confirm? Fantastic. Very good. So the ESN survey, it's ESN's most important project. We have been doing it since 2005, so it's already 14th editions. We don't have the final report of the latest edition just yet. That's going to be published in the next few months, so we will for sure share it also with your students who can disseminate in among your network. But of course, the 2021 edition was a very particular one because it was the one from the pandemic. It happened during the first semester of 2021. And it covered mostly students from the Erasmus Plus program simply because of the fact that Marlene presented before, because it's the biggest mobility program in Europe, but also students from other programs. And it has a very interesting thing, which is that half of the cohort was actually affected by the pandemic and half wasn't. So this is also something relevant in terms of the comparisons that we were able to make. And of course, the new mobility trends started to emerge with the survey, in which we saw that when it comes to the participants, they had very different experiences when it comes to the type of learning in which they engage. We had the 3 types of mobility that now people like to talk about: blended, physical, and virtual, with the majority of students actually engaging in the so-called blended formats, which were in this case very particular blended formats. Because in this case, what blended actually means is that most students did travel to the host destination, but in the host destination, they engage in online learning. So they were in their mobility destinations, living with other Erasmus students, as long as it was possible, engaging in social activities, etc. But of course, they were not able to go to physical classrooms because these were not happening. And it's also interesting, of course, to see that 20% of the students actually return to their home destination. It's a minority, but still a considerable number. And then, of course, because of this, I don't think it comes as a surprise that social life satisfaction was actually dealt a blow, especially among those students that were not able to have a fully physical mobility. It's always important to take these virtual, physical, and blended elements with a pinch of salt, because of course, what virtual and blended means is in most of the cases that the classes were online. Because as we saw, most of the students were actually in the mobility destination. But this clearly shows that going to classes is important, that meeting students is important, and that when this doesn't happen, this affects the quality of the mobility, more specifically when it comes to social life satisfaction. And indeed, satisfaction with social life also affects the feeling of integration in local communities. And we can see that there are stark differences when it comes to this feeling of integration, which was already something a bit problematic before the pandemic. ESN has seen for many years that even though students have a fantastic time during Erasmus, the integration with local communities remains a challenge. Many students say that they are not able to have so many local friends, that they struggle meeting people that are not international students. And this is why policy measures in this regard at the institutional, but also at the national level in terms of strategy are needed. Then let's move to the satisfaction part. And I think this is a very nice type of learning, of course, because mobility during the pandemic was difficult for all the stakeholders. It was extremely difficult for students, but also for universities that had to adapt. But what we can say is that the overall satisfaction was actually quite high. And the very nice thing is that we can compare the trends, and we can see that since 2016, overall satisfaction with the services provided by the universities has continuously improved. And students are more satisfied now than they have ever been. A very interesting thing here is that satisfaction is way higher when it comes to the services that the hosting institutions provide. So students are more satisfied with the universities that host them compared to the universities that actually send them on mobility. And this is something to consider whenever we think about how to improve mobility. They are especially satisfied, as we will see now, with aspects such as the welcome and orientation week, with very good rates of satisfaction, but also with linguistic support. And then, of course, we have a considerable drop, but there's also a good level of satisfaction with healthcare services, communication, etc. And then, well, important to also highlight that, as we said before, aspects such as accommodation, both in terms of support to find accommodation, but also the provision of accommodation, receive quite low numbers of satisfaction. And also when we see the dissatisfaction is quite high, and indeed the support for integration in the local communities, it's also quite low. And this is correlated with a high level of dissatisfaction. Then when it comes to the home institution, the institution that sends the students abroad, we see that, as we said before, reintegration activities involving the Erasmus alumni communities receive low levels of satisfaction that are indeed accompanied by high levels of dissatisfaction. And the elements that receive the highest level of satisfaction are those related to the application procedures, the fact of going abroad, receiving information about the mobility experience. Of course, this is because the people that we interview here were mobile students, because if we interview non-mobile students, we see that they are more dissatisfied with the provision of information. Then we also had a question in the survey related to the problems. So the previous one was about satisfaction, but we also had one about the problems. And it's really, really interesting to see what were the main problems that the students faced during their mobilities. Two elements stand out, and these two elements are not that normal in a normal mobility period. And these are indeed stress and anxiety. Of course, going on a mobility during a global pandemic is not easy because you don't really know what's going to happen tomorrow. You're not aware of all the health measures. They change continuously. Communication doesn't happen in English. So many of these factors that led to extremely high levels of stress and anxiety. And then other elements that are more normal, such as accommodation on the problems related to the courses, continue with more normal trends that we see consistently in different ESN surveys. Something curious is that actually health problems remain quite low. So students didn't report a lot of health problems. This is mainly because, as we know, COVID doesn't affect that much young people. So the mental health effects were more important than the normal health, the physical health effects. And something that is not that stark, but that I believe is quite relevant is this, the fears of social exclusion. It's not an extremely high number, but I believe since this is so grave, it's important to highlight it. 11% showcase this element of the social exclusion related problems. And then let's touch upon other very fascinating part of the COVID cohort, the COVID mobility cohort, which is the shift to online learning. What were the perceptions of students? The overall feeling is quite lukewarm because when we see, compared to other parts of the survey, the neutral part of the question and dissatisfaction, we clearly perceive that the students were not that convinced about the shift to online learning, which is normal because this learning, I mean, it was not planned in many cases, it happened from one day to the other. However, there is still an approval, let's say an overall approval, when it comes to the satisfaction with the overall quality of the online learning. 53% of students were either satisfied or very satisfied with the overall quality. The highest levels of dissatisfaction, I think they're not going to come as a surprise. They were indeed connected with interaction with other students. This one got the worst level, basically with very high level of dissatisfaction, very low level of satisfaction, and also with interaction with lecturers. So the one with the highest level was interaction with students, in which we saw that more than half were quite dissatisfied, but then also the interaction with lecturers and the inclusion of international students in the activities. Inclusion of international students in learning activities is something that it's normally quite challenging and complicated, right? Because this requires applying maybe different pedagogies in which we try to involve the students directly, creating small groups. So the three of them are actually quite interconnected. And there was a high level of satisfaction with digital learning tools and platforms. Then when it comes to the support, we see that academic support is the one that stands out, but we also have information provision on government measures. Many universities also partner up with ES and local sections to provide that kind of information to make sure that the students were informed. And we see that psychological support, it's indeed relevant, but it's not that high considering the big mental health problems that the students were enduring. So this is also a policy takeaway, right? Something to consider, how we can ensure that especially in situations of crisis, students are provided with this kind of support. And then we're getting to the final part, the main motivations to go mobility in COVID times. Nothing strange here. So students, even during COVID times, they want to go abroad because they want to experience different learning environments. They want to meet new people. They want to live abroad, learn languages, etc. So there's nothing to start here, nothing too strange. But it's interesting, right? That despite all the talk about why people go mobility, for survey we see that this idea of experiencing new and different learning environments is still the most relevant factor to go abroad. And then something that we are a bit obsessed with in ESN, because we believe there is still a lot of room for improvement, which is engagement and interaction. How do we make the mobility experience even more engaging? We see that the majority of students engage mostly with international students, and however, the engagement with local students remains quite low. The same for the members of the local community. And these numbers indeed were made worse during the COVID pandemic. And this also correlates to the type of activities that the students engage with. One of the aspects in which we see that we can clearly improve the mobility experience is precisely here, seeing that only half of students were engaging with activities that can help to improve interaction with local communities, such as belonging to student clubs, joining sport clubs, art clubs, etc. And this was made way worse during the COVID pandemic. This is indeed completely normal, right? Because it was way harder to find volunteering opportunities, to find maybe sport clubs during the pandemic because of the sanitary measures. But this is something to consider at the policymaking level when we are thinking, okay, what can we do to make mobility experiences better? I think it's particularly relevant to showcase something that is a big priority for the Erasmus Student Network, and that is also a big priority for the new Erasmus Plus program, which is the idea of civic engagement. When we see that there was a drop of almost 50% in the percentage of students that were volunteering in the local community, we see that it moved from 10% before the pandemic to 5.8 more or less percent during the pandemic times. However, other elements such as the participation in local sport clubs, which is actually the most relevant one, also suffered a drop, but it was lower, right? Probably because, of course, students were still trying to find opportunities to exercise, etc. And this is the general snapshot that I wanted to show you. And now, of course, I'm very much looking forward to a nice discussion with you, Marlene, but also with all the audience if they have questions or if you'd like to, enter into any of the points more in depth.
Yes, thanks a lot, Juan. First of all, I'm asking our listeners, is anyone having any questions? Because I won't start myself right away in case someone wants to ask or comment something already now. Like usually, people are very modest. They won't join in the very first moments. But anyway, I will open up the question and answers part on myself. And as we saw, those problems connected to mental health issues were actually the biggest problems for international students during the pandemic. And when we think what could be done in the future to avoid those problems in similar situations, because we don't know, maybe we will have COVID Vol 2 or I don't know, Vol 5, whatever. What are your recommendations, either for universities or policymakers? Could something be done centrally to influence the whole Erasmus program to pay more attention on those problems, or it should be like on university level?
I think it's a combination of both, because what we see is that there is a clear correlation between interaction and mental health related problems, right? So many students during the pandemic were living, of course, they are in another country with other families, with other close circles. But even many of them, especially during the first waves of the pandemic, didn't even have many flatmates, because many of the flatmates went back home. And when they started with the measures, they were not so close to their flatmates. So ensuring that students always have different types of support. So the first one will always be, of course, from the university services or from local services that also provide support to internationals. It's always the first part, right? When a university decides to host students, especially international students, they should acknowledge that there is a need to have availability for this kind of support measures, especially in terms of crisis, exclusion, etc. But then the peer-to-peer element is also fundamental. And this is something that we saw in terms of anecdotal evidence during the pandemic, that buddy systems were extremely important. Many students relied mainly on their buddies, right? So they were having calls with them because in mind that they were living alone, their flatmates had go back home, and they needed to have those conversations to stay, to stay afloat, to stay motivated, to stay more or less in a normal and stable state of mind. So the peer-to-peer element is fundamental. For that, universities can partner up with student unions, ESN local sections, student organizations, alumni, to make sure that most international students always have connections, also local connections that can help them to navigate these situations. So if we combine the more institutional support that should be provided through university services, and that can be complemented with extra support for international students, for instance, using organizational funds from Erasmus Plus, with peer-to-peer support that should be done and can be done together with student associations. That is actually going to fill most of the gaps, and it's going to ensure better results.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I already saw that one of our listeners, Ingrid, raised hand. So feel free, Ingrid, to ask or comment.
Hello, thank you, Juan, for a good presentation. I would like to here also maybe mention that it's extremely important to provide support already in the sending institution, like to find out if there is any support needed, like any advice needed before the mobility, because we have actually had quite a lot of cases when students come and then they face a lot of emotional issues here, mental issues, and it appears that they have not been getting any advice from their home institution, like to be prepared for mobility.
Yeah.
I don't say that like the university should say that you are not prepared, you don't go, but prepare them, like what it means to be away from home for half a year, maybe even more, and then especially during the time of pandemic, because I had quite a lot of students who actually had like these anxiety problems because all the seclusion that they had to be in the room, just online lectures, and it was very, very hard for them to deal with that. So they were still not prepared. So it's kind of like very important to do it already before mobility. Like, listen, you go into this country, you are maybe going to face these problems. We all give them also this kind of like a short course here when they arrive, but already when sending them, and I think universities have their own system how they select the students, what they do to prepare them, but it's extremely important. Thank you.
Absolutely. Ingrid. Thank you so much for this. I think you're raising such an important point, and the data is extremely clear with this, right? We really see that the students are very satisfied with mobility, but they are not satisfied at all with elements connected to preparation, reintegration. So in general, what should be the role of the sending institution? So I think there are a couple of things like to unpack here. The first one is now in academia, but also in the policy making sector, we're talking a lot about internationalization at home. And many times we talk about international at home as something that is completely separate to mobility. But what we believe in ESN is that all international initiatives are complementary. And one of the best things that you can do for internationalization is actually pre-departure preparation. Focus on properly preparing students before they go abroad. And there are so many tools at your disposal to do this that can also improve the quality of the mobility experience and the overall internationalization of the university. One is just simply preparation courses, which can be done by the university. Another very interesting one, which some universities do, it's reverse matching system. So also using your international students, your incoming students, to kind of match with prospective or outgoing students and start those dialogues, dealing with many of the questions, with many of the things that the students have in mind before going on mobility, and properly prepare them for both the intercultural side, but also the life in the university, because the way in which mobility agreements work is that most universities both host and send students with the same higher education institutions. So I think there is a lot of room for maneuver to play with that, right? To make sure that before mobility, in the run-up to the mobility experience, as soon as we have the students confirmed, but even before, we start with that engagement process. And also something that now it's getting a lot of relevance, which is the virtual element. It's perfectly, it can be perfectly feasible to organize calls, to organize online meetings in which students that are going to go to the same university can meet with the people from the International Relations Office, with the students from the university, and start dealing with both the learning process and also the practical questions, right? Because of course, students have a range of doubts before the mobility experience, but they can all be addressed. And I think that the relevance of this element is quite connected with the high level of satisfaction that we see with the welcome weeks, with all these activities that are done to provide information to students. So students are really eager to listen to all these things. And if we provide them with the needed information, with the needed intercultural preparation, the quality of the overall mobility experience is going to increase, and it can also benefit more people in our sending institutions. Just a couple of things that we can consider going forward.
Yeah, thanks a lot, both to Ingrid for the question and for Juan for the good answer. But you already mentioned this blended mobility and this virtual component that has become more common now during the pandemic. But what would you say, has it come to remain like this? Will there be more and more virtual component in international mobility as well, or how do you see it? And maybe you already can reflect how international students themselves feel about that. Do they like it or not?
Yeah. So blended and virtual are indeed here to stay. I mean, blended and virtual have been in the policy agenda for a while, especially virtual learning in the European context. We have been seeing references to virtual activities for now more than 20 or 30 years, right? So even when the internet was starting, there was already discussions about the importance of virtual learning, etc. But of course, the most important element is that now both programs, both virtual exchanges and blended intensive programs, have been included into the Erasmus Plus program. So you can actually apply for funding to host blended intensive programs in your university. I think that these programs have tremendous potential. So we really endorse the addition of this new internationalization tool to the toolbox of higher education institutions. The important thing is the implementation. In another survey, the Social Inclusion and Engagement in Mobility survey, one of our biggest projects in the field of inclusion, we saw that even though the majority of non-mobile students would prefer to go on a long-term mobility, there is also appetite for diverse lengths of mobility, diverse ways of engaging with the international experience. So the more opportunities we provide for students to engage with internationalization, the better. In that regard, especially these blended intensive programs that are a combination of a short mobility experience, short physical mobility experience with international virtual learning, can be a great addition for higher education institutions. First, because they can be done from the first year of university. So in the first year, students, as soon as they arrive to university, they can already participate in these programs. They can develop collaborative skills, which are extremely relevant nowadays, both in terms of social cohesion and for the labor market. And they can also go for the first time in a mobility for a short period of time and get familiar with it, which we believe can be a stepping stone towards a longer term mobility, right? So what we recommend is to try to implement these programs in the first years of the higher education journey. And also to make sure that there is a proper flow between the virtual learning and the physical experience, and that we properly plan the physical experience, because the virtual learning component is extremely important and it should address all the elements that I referred to before. The importance of interaction during online learning activities, like proper preparation, the role of the lecturers, involving stakeholders. So you can also do those things in an online environment, but then it's clear that the physical mobility should be the part in which we go even further when it comes to engagement, when it comes to brainstorming, working together. So we should avoid sending our students for 2 weeks only to do a couple of lectures, right? We should really try to get them to work together, to get them to present, to get them to put into practice the skills that they have been training during the online environment, and also not to overboard them with only the academic part, because indeed we know that the social dimension of that short-term mobility is key. They need to get to know the other students, they need to get to know the city, they can maybe engage in volunteering activities. The blended component can have this, also the civic engagement dimension. So there is a lot of potential. And then when it comes to virtual, it should be understood, in our opinion, as something complementary and also something that is clearly less impactful, but still extremely relevant, right? So of course, virtual exchange or collaborative online international learning can be great tools to widen the international portfolio of universities. But the important thing is that when we design policy measures, we remember that international student mobility, long-term physical mobility, remains the most impactful activity for universities, for mobile students, and even for non-mobile students, because of the multiplier effect that it brings. Because every time a student goes on exchange, it's not only that the students who benefits, it's also students from the class in which these students will participate, prospective flatmates, and a wide range of people that can benefit from that experience. So indeed, virtual and blended can be a very nice addition. It's just that in terms of priority, we believe that raising mobility numbers should stay at the core of our plans.
Yes, indeed. It's like always with the intriguing and good measures that it's all about the implementation, that how to do it so well that it really has impact. But still, dear listeners, do you have any further questions to Juan or any comments? It's absolutely welcome, and all questions are welcome. Both to chat in written or either asking yourself. Ingrid again.
Now, since nobody's asking, I ask.
Thanks a lot.
Just how are the plans for the future? Are you planning to carry out some survey as far as the impact of war is concerned, or
Yeah, so actually,
what have you seen there?
So our Ukrainian members, so ESN Ukraine joined the network in 2019. ESN in Ukraine for 3 years now, and they're extremely active. And they have carried out a survey among Ukrainian students, which got almost 500 answers. And these are students that are either abroad already because of the war, or that are thinking about going abroad. So it's regarding the international dimension, let's say the international education dimension of the war. And this survey, they are in the editing phase. So the survey will be published very soon. We hope to publish the final report of the ESN survey 2021 around the summer. And then we will start with the data collection for the new survey in probably around January or February of 2023. So this is the timeline. And indeed, we will touch upon, of course, the effects of the war. Of course, not the whole survey, because what we like to do with the ESN survey is to keep similar questions so we can do comparisons, right? So for instance, now many of the data that I gave you here, it's quite connected with questions that we asked in 2016, in 2017, so we can analyze trends, because we believe that's extremely important when it comes to mobility implementation. So for instance, we can see that the overall quality of mobility has improved with components such as the satisfaction with certain services, but we try to adapt. So of course, we touch upon COVID in 2021. We'll touch upon, of course, the effects of the war. But we will continue to collect data, because this is something that we like to do in ESN, right? We have this data-driven approach, and we will always connect it with the priorities of the program, but also with certain circumstances that are around us.
We have another question from Yanis. You're welcome to that.
Hello everybody. Thank you for this wonderful and very interesting presentation. Moving on to what Ingrid has asked, I think that it would be interesting to have some sort of data, not only about Ukrainian students, but also for other students who were affected by the war, such as Russian students or students of other nationalities who were either in the Ukraine or in Russia.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a very relevant topic, because I mean, there are two dimensions, right? Which is the Ukrainian dimension, in which we know that there were around 70,000 international students in Ukraine, mainly non-European students, so Indians, Africans, and they were extremely affected by the war. Actually, ESN Ukraine and ESN International, together with other actors, such as the European Students' Union, we have been working on that as well, because they face very particular problems. The good thing, I mean, there's no many good things because we're living through a war, right? But it's that many of the adaptation measures that have been taken, for instance, by the European Commission, such as expanding opportunities under Erasmus+, also involve non-Ukrainian students. So Indians, Africans, any student who was studying in Ukraine when the war started can benefit from the new measures that the Commission has created in terms of access to Erasmus opportunities. Of course, when it comes to Russia, it's totally different, but still many students were affected, and also many Russian students. that were in Europe, that didn't have access to their bank accounts. So the effect on Russian students is something that should be considered indeed. Then in terms of policy measures as well, what the Commission has done, which we welcome, is to stop the collaboration with public institutions, but continue the collaboration when it comes to individual mobilities. So Russian students will continue to have access to individual mobilities, such as Erasmus Plus, Erasmus Mundus, and other non-higher education programs, such as European Solidarity Corps. So we believe that this is actually the right approach. And also just going back to what Ingrid was said, because there's an important component that they didn't highlight. What we for sure know, both in terms of data, but also in terms of the experience from the ground, is that one of the big problems that the students are facing is information. So Ukrainian students still do not really know in which conditions they can access certain opportunities. This includes Erasmus Plus opportunities. For those who don't know, Erasmus has been completely open up for Ukrainians now who can apply in any European university for Erasmus Plus funds. But also when it comes to the compatibility of grants, the portability of certain elements, recognition. So Ukrainian students still struggle to understand in which conditions they can access higher education in their hosting countries. And this is something to work on at all levels, at the European level, national level, and also institutional level. And in ESN, we're going to launch a campaign, hopefully in the coming weeks, explaining how these Erasmus opportunities are going to work for Ukrainian students.
Gracias, Juan.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Efkaristos.
Yeah, very, very exciting discussion indeed. We have already covered very many timely topics like pandemic and impact of war. But when we prepared for the webinar, we also touched the topic of sustainability and green Erasmus. So I would like to bring this in as well. I know you have an interesting project on this topic, and maybe you can introduce this side of international mobility as well.
Absolutely. Actually, I would like to start when it comes to sustainability, by highlighting a data point from the ESN survey as well. Normally, in all ESN surveys, we ask students about their competence development and also their, let's say, their fields of interest. So basically, we ask them, in which concrete topic did you gain more interest throughout your ability? And normally, we include aspects such as world affairs, human rights, and this year we also included sustainability and environmental affairs. And what we saw is that when students go abroad, the topic in which they gain more interest is actually sustainability. So they go abroad and they become more aware about the importance of, sustainability, the climate crisis, the problems related to climate change. So what we can see is that sending students abroad can help to increase awareness among young people of the presence and the importance of sustainability. And of course, because of that, because this we kind of knew, but we wanted to have the data, in 2020, we also started with the Green Erasmus Plus project, in which we wanted to first understand the habits of the Erasmus generation in terms of sustainability. This includes before, during, and after departure, and design tools in terms of policy, but also in terms of implementation to make mobility experiences more sustainable. What did we see? Well, what we saw is that, first of all, price remains the biggest challenge to make mobilities more sustainable, because students struggle in financial terms. This is something that we also see in the survey. We see it in the SIM project. So basically, they don't have the money to be as sustainable as they would like to. But the mobility experiences does bring certain changes in habits that are quite interesting. Students walk more and take less, for instance, as a transportation like cars or like planes during the mobility, or students acquire certain sustainable habits during their mobilities. And then also what we believe is that the civic engagement component is quite connected with the sustainability component. So during mobility, there is a need to develop these citizenship skills, but they can be very connected to green skills, because students have, let's say, can have the time, if universities support them, to volunteer more, to spend more time working with environmental affairs, but they need the support from the university side. And then what we're trying to work now, it's on policy measures, but also even on partnerships to help students to travel more sustainable, to have access to a more sustainable way of life. For that, Erasmus Plus has created a new top-up for green travel, but the top-up is not really high, right? So students struggle to fund their travels with only the support of the top-up. Very soon, we're going to launch a pledge to try to change this top-up and increase the money that the students get to travel sustainable. Here, it's very important to be, especially Marlene, I'm talking to you, you are in Estonia, I am in Brussels, I come from Spain, Erasmus in Istanbul. European students have a diversity of experiences that should be considered. So in our opinion, what we should try to do in the coming years is to make sure that especially those students that can have access to feasible, sustainable travel have the opportunity to do so. Most of mobilities in Europe happen between 5 countries, the big ones. So Germany, France, Spain, and Italy concentrate the vast majority of mobilities. And those countries are not that far apart. So we can start focusing on these students while we gradually try to promote slow travel, we promote different ways in which students can have more sustainable mobilities. And we also focus on during the mobility experience, not only the travel, which is key, but also how the day-to-day of students can be made more sustainable and how we use the Erasmus experience as a big activator, let's say, as a big booster of green skills, green competences. For that, in Green Erasmus now, we are developing a toolkit of sustainable activities that we can give to student associations and to universities that will provide examples on how you can organize these sustainable activities at the local level. We are working in these policy adaptations. We're also working with another youth NGO called Erasmus by Train to make a proposal for an Erasmus train ticket that could be used to foster the sustainable travel. And now, since the midterm review of Erasmus Plus is slowly approaching, to really focus on these concrete measures that the program can take to support green mobility, both in terms of transport, but also in terms of habits and civic engagement.
Thanks a lot. I think it's a very good point that maybe sometimes we are very stuck only in the issue of transportation when talking about green mobility, but actually this is only like one part of it, like going there and coming back. But actually we should focus on the habits and lifestyle changes during mobility, because this has this very long-term impact if it's done professionally and well. So it's a very good point, definitely, that you pointed out. But any questions or comments also regarding this topic? Yes, Yanis again.
Okay, I was yesterday in the Directors General for Higher Education meeting in Paris, and there were 3 students there who shared their experiences with mobility and Erasmus. And one of the issues that came up was excessive bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Do you also consider this to be a major problem?
Yeah, 100%. So this bureaucracy is a problem from many perspectives. We have the data that backs it up. In this survey, we can see it in a couple of places, but we can see it very clearly in the social inclusion and engagement in mobility project. I will also share the info with Marlene so you can have it as a follow-up. And we should look at administrative barriers from various perspectives. The first one is the connection between bureaucracy and financial problems, because one of the main challenges that the students face is that they don't really understand, because of the bureaucracy, how much money they are going to get, when they are going to get it, and how the application process works. So they are confused by the process of applying for Erasmus, receiving the money, and then like navigating that situation. So one of the best and easiest ways to widen participation in Erasmus is to make the financial elements of the mobility more clear and less obscure. So before applying, students completely understand how much money they are going to get for the mobility, when they are going to get it, through which means, what do they need to do to justify, etc. Because that needs to be streamlined, since at the moment, even at the national level, there are huge differences in application processes, in the conditions of the grant agreement. In some countries, you have almost all the funds arriving before the mobility. In some others, from our data, we see that there are huge delays in the reception of the grants. So this is one part. And indeed, the other one, it's more connected about the academic element of the mobility and the bureaucracy behind it, in which we also see in the survey that many students still have big problems in terms of changing the learning agreement, choosing courses, understanding whether the course catalog, it's rightly updated, getting the courses accepted in the learning agreement. This is something that we also discussed recently, that now that recognitions problems have improved, so ex post recognition, a very big challenge for students is to make the learning agreement, to agree on a learning agreement, right? So to have that discussion with the coordinator. How to fix these problems? We would say that for sure, overhauling completely the grant system, making it more clear and more streamlined, developing clear timelines. This can be done through the Erasmus Plus app, and already the Commission is working on that. So a student, before applying, can clearly see what are all the steps from being interested in Erasmus until going on mobility. Combining digitalization with simplification, so there are less documents involved, and we move from so many ex ante checks to more ex post, for instance, in terms of reception of the grants, documents to confirm things, etc. And also, of course, the role of the digitalization process in all this, right? Now we have the European Student Card Initiative that aims at digitalizing the mobility experience. We have the Erasmus Plus app. We need to implement these initiatives swiftly, even if it takes commitment also at the national level. But not only that, but also rethinking each step to make it more simple. They're having improvements in bureaucracy, but unless we do these things, the challenges for students will remain, and many students will continue to see bureaucracy as a barrier to go on Erasmus.
Thanks. I was thinking about another question as well, because I was thinking back about the pandemic period as well, and what didn't come up earlier, but actually came to my head now, that maybe you can comment. Are there any changes in these most popular destination countries as well after the pandemic? Do you have any data? Have you seen any trends in changes in mobility patterns, or it's not clear yet?
So probably it's interesting, right? Because it has kind of coincided with the pandemic, but it's not really a pandemic effect. The biggest change is probably going to happen related to the UK. Because of course the UK was one of the most popular mobility destinations. It was the fourth country, if I recall correctly. And now with the new program, even though, and this is very important, your opportunities to send students to the UK remain, thanks to the changes in the international dimension of Key Action 131. So basically now the normal Erasmus will allow universities to send up to 20% of students anywhere in the world. But not in the same volume, right? Because many universities have had a lot of agreements. So now in these new calls that universities applied for instance, this year and the previous one, this was a big problem in terms of changing the availability, right, of mobility destinations. So what we see, we still don't have the data, of course, because the reports come always, like almost 1.5 years later. But we see a huge interest in mobility. So with all the national agencies we have spoken to have told us that mobility numbers have not only reached the number before the pandemic, but actually increased, in some cases almost double. So interest for outgoing mobility, it's increasing drastically across Europe. This is the very, I would say the first element to consider. The second one, which is more forward-looking, but is very important in terms of changes of mobility patterns, is this new opportunity to send 20% of students anywhere in the world, because we will have to monitor how universities, with all that room for maneuver, create their international opportunities, right? Whether they include more the UK, Switzerland, other European countries, whether they go for the neighborhood, or whether they try to establish more connections with industrialized countries such as the US, Canada, Australia, where we know there's a lot of, like interest also from the student side in going on mobility to these countries. So this is going to be something that should be monitored closely, because we agree with the idea of the Commission that the mobility offer that universities provide should be as varied as possible. You should really combine different types of mobility destinations. But the good news, and I believe this is kind of the bottom line here, is that physical mobility is back. Students have more interest in physical mobility than they ever did. Students do not take for granted these opportunities now, because of course, after 2 years of pandemic, we value more a crucial element in Europe, which is freedom of movement. I mean, like for us, especially for my generation, freedom of movement is something that we took for granted. The ability to cross borders, even though not all young people have access to this because of financial reasons. But now we value it more than ever. So now the challenge is to make sure that we continuously increase mobility opportunities for all, and also awareness about these opportunities. And since I have Janice here, it was very interesting to see that in the latest Eurobarometer, we saw that Greece is the country in which more young people know about Erasmus. They know that it exists. Because, however, in other countries in Western and Northern Europe, awareness is not that high. And of course, that we try to, to provide more support financially in terms of removing barriers. So we increase mobility numbers because they remain very low across Europe. We haven't reached the 20% target that the European higher education area set 10 years ago. We haven't reached the 20% target that the European Union set 10 years ago. And now it's time to be even more ambitious, in our opinion, and to try to make mobility a key feature of all higher education journeys, together with other internationalization opportunities, such as blended, virtual learning, participation in international student organizations, etc.
Yes, word to Yanis once again, yes.
Just a few words. I was thrilled to hear what Juan had to say. And I think that it is very important for Europe to witness a certain shift for the mobility towards countries which are not in the foreground, let's say, which are not the big industrialized countries, but it is very promising to see that young people are interested in learning the culture and, of course, the educational system of a country which has so much to offer. And I don't speak only for Greece, I speak for every smaller country in Europe. Thanks.
Absolutely, and thank you for raising that. I do think that balanced mobility flows should be, they are a core priority in terms of policy, but now they should, be also a core priority in terms of implementation. So I think that we all have a responsibility, universities, policymakers, student organizations like ESN, promoting these opportunities, convincing students that they should go also to different mobility destinations, creating this multiplier effect, like replicating mobility experiences. And I believe that if we do this, we're also contributing to a more cohesion Europe, and a world with more solidarity. So the idea of balanced mobility can have so many positive implications that we should for sure make it a priority. Because we also need, and this is the interesting thing, we also need Nordics, people from the Northern Europe coming to our countries. I'm a South European myself, seeing, understanding differences, and the other way around. This is how we create this idea of European citizenship, world citizenship, and European solidarity.
Yes, thanks a lot. It's soon time to wrap the discussion up, but just to be sure, I'm asking once again, that are there any other comments or questions? So this is the time, the last chance. And if not, then I would like to ask myself a very general question, that is there anything that you were thinking about when you got the invitation to this EUROSTUDENT Talks webinar and we haven't covered yet today? So is there anything that you feel that still is worth mentioning now?
And no, I mean, I would like to do a bit of shameless self-promotion. So I would like to, like invite people to go through our reports. We have the Green Erasmus report that you can read in our webpage, and the Green Erasmus webpage, the Social Inclusion and Engagement in Mobility report, which is I would say, the most relevant study on widening participation in Erasmus Plus and inclusive mobility. I am a big fan of EUROSTUDENT. I believe that the role that EUROSTUDENT plays is fundamental. So it was a tremendous honor to be here today. But for me, the message that they want to push across here is that now, after the pandemic, we are seeing that internationalization is more important than ever. We see it after the pandemic. We see it, unfortunately, with the war. And with student mobility, what we have is a very simple, effective, useful tool of bringing people together, boosting employability, boosting civic competences. So we should not take it for granted. We should not think that now we have Erasmus, it happens naturally, there is nothing we can do, because there are so many things that we can do to improve it. Civic engagement, accommodation, reintegration, there's so much potential there. We now have more tools than ever. We now have more data than ever. And what we need is to continue building bridges, to continue supporting, like students, to continue building collaborations between organizations like us, like ESN, universities, governments, and European institutions. And if we do this, I think that with the new Erasmus Plus program, we can have a tremendous success that will really help to get Erasmus to the next level, right? To really make it an even more important flagship program of the European Union, with a stronger global component than ever, which is also something to highlight. The global component that Erasmus can play, being the most relevant internationalization program all over the world, is something that we should all be proud of, and we should all help to make a reality.
I'm sure it's a very great message to finish with. So thank you, Juan, once again, for coming and sharing all
Thank you so much.
And data. And thanks for all the listeners and those who were extremely active to join in today. I'm very, very thankful. And I'm also doing some shameless promotion then, that on the 22nd of June, we will have our next webinar, and then we will focus very, very probably on financing systems of higher education, and it will be a researcher's perspective, very probably. So stay tuned and follow EUROSTUDENT in Twitter. We are usually the quickest there to introduce our next topics. And once again, thank you, everyone. And maybe Juan, you can stay here for some couple of minutes.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and have a nice day. And see you next time.